When the true self is exiled in the name of conditional love, there is a moment in every life when the soul makes a silent pact with survival. It whispers, "I will become what they need me to be, so they won't leave me in the darkness." But what if that pact was written in disappearing ink, and the price was forgetting who you came here to be? Somewhere in the forgotten corridors of your earliest memories, a small version of you learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that love comes with conditions, that your natural radiance, your untamed curiosity, your spontaneous joy had to be measured, modulated, made acceptable. The child who once danced without watching for approval slowly learned to perform, even when no one was watching. This is not a story about becoming someone new. This is about remembering who you were before the world taught you to apologize for your existence. The true self doesn't begin when we find ourselves. It begins when we stop abandoning ourselves for the promise of belonging. The Theatre of Echoes. She was 7 when she first noticed the theatre. Every morning she would wake up and choose a mask from the invisible collection that hung behind her bedroom door. The good daughter mask for breakfast, the perfect student mask for school, the grateful child mask for dinner. By nightfall, she had forgotten which face was originally hers. The mirrors in her house began reflecting only the masks, never the girl beneath. Years later, in therapy, she would weep not for what she had lost, but for realizing she had never known what was there to lose. The Garden of Conditional Blooms. There was once a gardener who only watered the flowers that bloomed in the shapes he approved of. The roses learned to grow in perfect circles. The wildflowers practiced symmetry until they lost their wild. But in the forgotten corner of the garden, where the gardener's attention never reached, a single flower grew crooked and magnificent, reaching toward a sun that loved it exactly as it was. The other flowers whispered that it was broken, but the crooked flower knew something they had forgotten. It was the only one still growing toward the light instead of toward approval. The House of Borrowed Voices. Carl Jung once observed that the most terrifying thing is not that we might fail, but that we might succeed at being someone we were never meant to be. In his practice, he encountered countless souls who had built magnificent houses, careers, relationships, identities, using borrowed blueprints. They achieved everything they thought they wanted, only to discover they were living in structures that suffocated their essence. The House of Borrowed Voices always has perfect acoustics for everyone else's needs, but somehow your own voice never carries in those rooms. The phenomenon that modern psychology calls false self-compliance is as old as humanity itself. But what the clinical language cannot capture is the spiritual tragedy at its heart. When we fragment ourselves for love, we don't just lose authenticity, we lose access to the part of us that knows how to receive love authentically. The child's nervous system, in its desperate wisdom, learns to suppress not just behaviors, but entire aspects of being. What Jung called the shadow is often not our darkness, but our light, all the parts of us that were too bright, too much, too inconvenient for the emotional containers we were born into. The intuitive child learns to doubt their inner knowing. The sensitive child learns to numb their perceptions. The creative child learns to color within lines that someone else drew. But here lies the profound paradox. The more we abandon our essence to secure love, the less capable we become of recognizing love when it arrives without conditions. We become fluent in the language of performance, but forget the dialect of genuine connection. Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life, but you can't remember when you handed over the script? Do you find yourself saying yes when your soul is screaming no, smiling when grief wants to move through you, shrinking when your spirit wants to expand? That exhaustion you feel, it's not from working too hard. It's from working against your own grain for so long that you've forgotten which direction you naturally grow. Maybe you've noticed that the people who claim to love you seem to love only certain versions of you. The version that doesn't need too much. The version that doesn't ask uncomfortable questions. The version that fits neatly into their story about who you should be. And somewhere in the quiet moments between performances you wonder, what would happen if I stopped being who they need me to be and started being who I came here to be? Tonight, before sleep finds you, try this. Sit with your back against something solid. A wall, a tree, the earth itself. Close your eyes and ask your body this question. What have I been pretending not to know about myself? Don't think the answer. Let it arise like a memory surfacing from deep water. Write down whatever comes, even if it makes no logical sense. This is not about understanding, it's about listening. The soul speaks in symbols, in sensations, in sudden knowings that bypass the mind's careful editing. And if nothing comes, if the silence feels empty, know that this too is information. Sometimes the first thing we must recover is the ability to hear our own voice beneath all the borrowed words we've been speaking. The dopamine of praise, why the brain gets addicted to external approval. But what if I told you that the hunger for approval isn't just emotional? It's biochemical, and that understanding this changes everything. There is a laboratory hidden in your skull where invisible chemists work around the clock, measuring the world's response to your existence. Every smile of approval releases a small dose of heaven. Every frown of disapproval floods the system with something that feels like dying. Without knowing it, you became an addict to a drug that only other people could supply. And like all addictions, the dose you needed kept increasing while the relief kept diminishing. The brain's reward system was designed to help us survive in tribes of 30, not to navigate a world where validation comes from thousands of strangers on screens. What was once a survival mechanism has become a spiritual prison. But here's the sacred secret. When you understand the biochemistry of approval addiction, you can begin to rewire not just your mind, but your relationship with the divine within you. The dopamine oracle. In her dream, she found herself in an ancient temple where the oracle spoke only in the language of approval. "You are worthy," the oracle whispered, and golden light flooded her veins. "You are talented," it continued, and she felt herself grow taller, brighter. But when the oracle fell silent, the light began to fade, and she found herself grasping at shadows, begging for another word, another hit of worthiness. She woke up realizing she had been living this dream for 30 years, cycling between the ecstasy of praise and the withdrawal of its absence. The validation merchant. Dr. Anna Lemke's research on dopamine reveals what mystics have always known. The brain cannot distinguish between genuine nourishment and artificial stimulation. There was a woman who collected compliments like others collect coins, storing each one in a mental vault she would visit during moments of doubt. But she noticed something strange. The older compliments seemed to lose their power, like food spoiling in storage. She needed fresher praise, stronger doses, more frequent hits. She had become a merchant trading pieces of her soul for temporary biochemical relief, never realizing she was both the buyer and the currency. The applause alchemist. In medieval times, alchemists believed they could turn lead into gold. What they didn't know is that their descendants would learn to turn approval into identity, praise into self-worth, validation into meaning. But just as the medieval alchemists discovered, some transformations violate natural law. The applause alchemist could create temporary gold, but it would always turn back to lead in the silence of solitude. The real alchemy, the mystics whispered, was learning to find gold in the places where no one was clapping. Neuroscientist Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research reveals that intermittent reinforcement, praise that comes unpredictably, creates the strongest addiction patterns in the brain. This is why social media algorithms are so psychologically captivating, and why the child who received inconsistent approval grows into an adult who can never feel enough validation. But here's what the research cannot capture. When we outsource our sense of worth to external sources, we literally rewire our brains to experience self-abandonment as normal. The neural pathways that should connect us to our inner knowing become atrophied, while the pathways that scan for external validation become superhighways of anxiety. The polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, shows us that chronic approval seeking activates our sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. We become hypervigilant to social cues, constantly scanning for threats to our acceptability. This state of chronic activation makes it neurologically difficult to access the ventral vagal state, where authentic self-connection occurs. What ancient wisdom traditions called spiritual bypassing neuroscience now understands as dopamine dysregulation. When we use external validation as our primary source of internal regulation, we create what addiction specialists call tolerance. We need increasingly larger doses to feel the same relief. Do you recognize that moment when you post something online and then compulsively check for responses, feeling your mood rise and fall with each notification, or the way your sense of self seems to fluctuate based on how others receive your ideas, your appearance, your choices? That's not weakness. That's your nervous system responding to a hijacked reward system. Maybe you've noticed that the people whose approval you most desperately seek are often the ones who withhold it most skillfully, or that achieving the validation you thought would finally satisfy you only creates a deeper hunger, like drinking salt water for thirst. The exhaustion you feel isn't from trying too hard. It's from running on a biochemical treadmill that was never designed to take you home to yourself. For the next 7 days, practice what I call dopamine fasting from external validation. This doesn't mean isolating yourself. It means becoming conscious of your validation-seeking patterns. Before you speak, post, or act, pause and ask, am I doing this to express my truth or to harvest approval? Notice the physical sensations that arise when you resist the urge to seek validation. The anxiety, the restlessness, the feeling that something is missing. This is withdrawal, and it's temporary. Your nervous system is remembering how to find safety in your own presence rather than in others' responses. The golden prison. When the ideal self becomes the executioner of the true self, there's something most people never realize. The version of yourself you've been trying so hard to become might be the very thing that's killing who you actually are. In the deepest chambers of the psyche lives a tyrant wearing the mask of perfection. It speaks in the voice of improvement, of becoming better, of reaching higher. But listen carefully to its demands. You should be more patient, more successful, more spiritual, more attractive, more anything but what you are right now. This inner dictator has convinced you that your natural self is the rough draft, and somewhere out there exists a final version worthy of love. But what if the pursuit of this phantom self has become the very prison that keeps your soul in exile? The ideal self is not your higher nature calling you forward. It's often your wounded self trying to earn love by becoming someone else entirely. True transformation doesn't happen when we improve ourselves into acceptability. It happens when we stop abandoning the parts of ourselves that were never broken to begin with. The golden prison looks like success from the outside, but inside, your authentic soul is slowly suffocating on borrowed dreams. The Museum of Discarded Selves. She discovered it by accident, walking through the corridors of her dreams, a vast museum filled with glass cases, each containing a version of herself she had abandoned in pursuit of becoming better. There was the 5-year-old who painted with wild abandon before someone taught her about proper art, the teenager who wrote poetry that made her friends uncomfortable, the young woman who laughed too loudly before learning that quiet was more ladylike. Each discarded self pressed their hands against the glass, not in anger but in longing, wanting to be remembered, wanting to be integrated, wanting to contribute their gifts to the woman she was trying to become. She realized she had been climbing a ladder toward an ideal that required her to step on every version of herself that had ever been real. The perfectionist's paradox. Dr. Brené Brown's research reveals that perfectionism is not about high standards, it's about fear. But there was a man who discovered something even more disturbing. His perfectionism wasn't just protecting him from shame. It was actively destroying the parts of himself that were already whole. He had spent 20 years becoming the perfect husband, the perfect father, the perfect professional. He achieved everything he thought would make him worthy of love. But in the silence of his success, he heard a voice he hadn't heard in decades. The voice of the boy who used to build worlds out of mud and stories, who believed that being alive was miracle enough. That boy was still inside, not improved or evolved, but buried alive under the weight of becoming someone better. The Golden Mask Meditation. In ancient Greek theater, actors wore masks to portray different characters. But what happens when the mask becomes so beautiful, so admired, so successful, that you forget it's just a costume? James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, spoke of the golden shadow, the parts of ourselves we exile not because they're dark, but because they're too bright, too authentic, too inconvenient for the character we're trying to play. There was a woman who meditated for years on becoming more compassionate, more patient, more enlightened. But in her pursuit of spiritual perfection, she had banished her righteous anger, her protective fierceness, her capacity for holy rebellion. She became so spiritually correct that she lost access to the wild wisdom that had always been her greatest gift. What Carl Jung called the persona becomes pathological when it stops being a useful social tool and starts becoming a prison for the authentic self. The ideal self is often constructed not from our genuine aspirations, but from the wounds of our past. The child who was criticized for being too much grows into an adult who tries to become just right. Dr. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion reveals that people with high self-criticism show the same brain activation patterns as people experiencing physical threat. When we constantly measure ourselves against an impossible ideal, our nervous system literally experiences our authentic self as dangerous. We develop what psychologists call self-concept contingency. Our sense of worth becomes dependent on meeting external standards rather than honoring internal truth. But here's the spiritual paradox. The qualities we exile in pursuit of the ideal self don't disappear. They go underground and begin to sabotage us from within. The spontaneous person who tries to become more controlled finds themselves paralyzed by perfectionism. The sensitive person who tries to become tougher finds themselves numb to life's beauty. The passionate person who tries to become more rational finds their creativity dying in the pursuit of respectability. The Gestalt therapy concept of introjection explains how we swallow whole the expectations of others, making their voices louder than our own internal knowing. We become what psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott called a false self, compliant, adaptive, successful, and secretly dying inside. Have you ever achieved something you thought you wanted desperately, only to feel empty instead of fulfilled? Do you find yourself exhausted not from working toward your dreams, but from working toward dreams that never quite felt like yours? Maybe you've noticed that the more successful you become at being the person you think you should be, the more disconnected you feel from the person you actually are. Perhaps you recognize that voice inside that's never satisfied, always pushing you to be better, do more, improve faster. You might have mistaken this voice for motivation, but notice how it feels in your body. Tight, anxious, never at rest. That's not your soul calling you forward. That's your wounded self trying to earn love through perfection. Do you remember the last time you did something purely because it brought you joy, not because it improved you or impressed anyone? If you can't remember, you're not alone. The golden prison is so beautiful from the outside that we often don't realize we've been locked inside. Tonight, I invite you to perform what I call the reunion ritual. Set aside 30 minutes of uninterrupted time. Light a candle if you have one, not for atmosphere, but as a beacon for the parts of yourself that have been in exile. Close your eyes and ask this question: what part of myself did I abandon in order to become acceptable? Wait for images, memories, or sensations to arise. Don't analyze them. Welcome them. Now imagine that abandoned part of yourself as a child sitting across from you. What would you say to them? What would you apologize for? What gifts did they carry that you sacrificed for approval? Write them a letter, not from your ideal self to your broken self, but from your current self to your authentic self, acknowledging what was lost and inviting what was exiled to come home. Silence as a detox ritual from image addiction. What if the most radical thing you could do in a world addicted to image is to disappear for a while and remember what it feels like to exist without an audience? There is a silence that terrifies the false self more than any criticism ever could. It's the silence where no one is watching, no one is judging, no one is measuring your worth against their expectations. In this silence, the masks begin to slip, the performance stops. The carefully curated version of yourself has nowhere to hide, and what remains is either nothing or everything you've been hiding from the world. Most people run from this silence, but those brave enough to enter it discover that it's not empty. It's full of the voices they've been drowning out their entire lives. Silence is not the absence of something, it's the presence of everything you are beneath the noise of who you think you should be. In a culture that profits from your insecurity, choosing silence becomes an act of spiritual rebellion. It's a return to the womb of your own being, where you can remember what you felt like before the world taught you to perform your existence for approval. The digital detox desert. She entered what felt like a digital desert. 7 days without posting, sharing, or performing her life for invisible audiences. On the first day, her fingers moved phantom-like toward her phone, muscle memory reaching for validation that wasn't there. By the third day, she noticed something terrifying. Without the constant feedback loop of likes and comments, she wasn't sure who she was. But by the 7th day, in the depths of that identity crisis, she heard something she hadn't heard in years, the sound of her own thoughts, unedited, unfiltered, unperformed. She realized she had been living her life as a constant audition for people she would never meet, and in the silence, she finally got to meet herself. The mirror fasting monk. There was once a monk who covered all the mirrors in his monastery, not out of vanity's opposite, but to break the addiction to self-image that kept him from self-knowledge. Dr. Antonio Damasio's research on the neurological self reveals that we have multiple layers of selfhood: the core self that exists in pure awareness, and the autobiographical self that exists in story and image. The monk discovered that every time he looked in a mirror, he was consulting the autobiographical self. Am I looking spiritual enough, peaceful enough, holy enough? But when the mirrors were covered, he found the core self, the one that existed before he learned to see himself through others' eyes. The Invisible Woman's Liberation. Marion Woodman, the Jungian analyst, tells of a woman who became so tired of managing her image that she performed what she called social disappearing. Not hermitage, but strategic invisibility. She stopped updating social media, stopped explaining herself, stopped managing how others perceived her choices. At first, she felt the panic of non-existence. If no one was witnessing her life, was she really living it? But as the withdrawal symptoms of image addiction began to fade, she discovered something extraordinary. She began to live from the inside out, instead of the outside in. Her choices started arising from genuine desire rather than strategic positioning. She had been performing her life so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply live it. What we call social media addiction is actually image addiction, the compulsive need to curate, present, and validate a version of ourselves for external consumption. Dr. Larry Rosen's research shows that constant image management activates the same neural pathways as substance addiction, complete with tolerance, withdrawal, and craving cycles. But the spiritual dimension goes deeper than neuroscience can measure. When we live constantly in the gaze of others, real or imagined, we lose access to what contemplatives call the witness consciousness, the part of us that can observe our experience without immediately translating it into content for others' consumption. We develop what I call audience anxiety, the inability to be present with our own experience without wondering how it looks from the outside. The embodiment practices of somatic therapy reveal something profound. When we stop performing our emotions and start actually feeling them, our nervous system begins to regulate differently. The polyvagal system, which governs our sense of safety, can only fully relax when we're not being observed or evaluated. This is why solitude isn't just psychologically healing, it's neurologically necessary. Rumi wrote, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." But we can only feel that pull when we step out of the marketplace of image management and into the sanctuary of our own unwitnessed being. If this is touching something deep inside you, something that recognizes the exhaustion of performing your existence for others, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of souls who are ready to stop performing and start living. Hit that notification bell, because these conversations don't exist anywhere else, and your soul needs to hear what we're exploring together. Do you recognize that strange anxiety that arises when you're alone with yourself, without distractions, without anyone to perform for? That restlessness that drives you toward your phone, toward noise, toward anything but the raw presence of your own being. That's not boredom. That's image withdrawal. You've been living on the drug of external validation for so long that your own company feels foreign, insufficient, incomplete. Maybe you've noticed that you can't experience beauty without immediately thinking about how to capture it, share it, translate it into content. The sunset exists not as wonder but as potential post. The meal exists not as nourishment but as aesthetic moment. Your own life has become raw material for the performance of living, rather than the actual experience of being alive. Have you forgotten what it feels like to have a thought that no one else will ever know? To feel an emotion without analyzing how it might be perceived? To make a choice based solely on what your soul is calling for, not what will generate the best response from your audience? For the next 48 hours, practice what I call the invisibility ritual. This is not about isolation. It's about existing without performance. Don't post anything online. Don't take photos of your experiences. Don't explain your choices to anyone unless absolutely necessary. More importantly, practice being with yourself without the internal audience. When you eat, just eat. Don't think about how the meal looks or what you'll say about it later. When you walk, just walk. Don't curate the experience into story or content. Create what I call mirror-free zones in your day. Spend time in spaces where you can't see your reflection, can't monitor your appearance, can't adjust your image. Notice what happens in your body when you're not managing how you look or appear to others. At the end of each day, sit in complete silence for 10 minutes. No music, no guided meditation, no spiritual practice. Just you with the sound of your own breathing and the presence of your own being. Write down what you notice. What arises when there's no one to perform for? What voices emerge when the external noise stops? What does your soul want to tell you that it's been too polite to say while you were busy managing your image for others? The wound of exile and the return of the instinctual self. But what if the deepest wound isn't what was done to you, but what you learned to do to yourself in order to survive it? There is a wound that goes deeper than trauma, deeper than betrayal, deeper than loss. It's the wound of self-exile, the moment when you learn to abandon yourself before anyone else could abandon you first. This wound doesn't just hurt, it fragments. It takes the instinctual self, the part of you that knows without thinking, feels without permission, trusts without evidence, and sends it into hiding so deep that you forget it was ever there. The exile becomes so complete that you don't just lose touch with who you are. You lose touch with the fact that there was ever anyone there to lose. Healing is not about fixing what's broken. It's about calling home what was banished. The instinctual self didn't leave because it was wounded. It left because staying would have meant psychological death. But what we exile for survival in childhood becomes what we must retrieve for wholeness in adulthood. The return of the instinctual self is not recovery, it's resurrection. The orphan's inheritance. She was 43 when she finally understood that she had been living as an emotional orphan her entire adult life, not because she lacked parents, but because she had learned so early to abandon her own emotional needs that she had become homeless within her own being. Dr. Gabor Mate's work on trauma reveals that children don't stop needing. They stop feeling their needs when those needs become too dangerous to their attachment bonds. She had spent decades trying to heal from what others had done to her, but the deeper wound was what she had learned to do to herself, the daily practice of self-abandonment that had become as automatic as breathing. The wild woman's recall. Clarissa Pinkola Este speaks of the wild woman archetype, the instinctual psyche that knows how to create, how to destroy what needs destroying, how to intuit danger and opportunity with animal wisdom. There was a woman who realized she had spent 20 years in therapy trying to become more civilized, more appropriate, more manageable, and in doing so had sedated the very part of her that held her life force. Her panic attacks weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were her wild nature trying to break through the prison of propriety. Her rage wasn't something to medicate. It was information about boundaries that had been violated. Her sensitivity wasn't a weakness to overcome. It was a superpower she had been taught to see as pathology. The somatic detective. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing work reveals that trauma is not just stored in memory. It's stored in the body's instinctual responses. There was a man who discovered that his chronic anxiety wasn't a character flaw, but his nervous system's way of saying, "We never learned it was safe to relax." His difficulty trusting people wasn't paranoia, but his body's wisdom, remembering that early trust had been dangerous. Instead of medicating his symptoms, he began to dialogue with them. "What are you trying to protect me from?" he would ask his racing heart. "What do you need me to know?" he would whisper to his tight shoulders. Slowly, he began to understand that his body had been trying to save his life, and in return, he began to save his body from the chronic hypervigilance that had become his normal. What attachment theory calls disorganized attachment is really organized exile, the child's brilliant strategy for surviving in an environment where their authentic responses were too threatening to their survival. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on window of tolerance shows us that when children's nervous systems are repeatedly overwhelmed, they learn to live outside their natural capacity for regulation. But here's what the clinical language cannot capture. When we exile our instinctual responses, we don't just lose our ability to feel, we lose our ability to know. The instinctual self is our internal guidance system, our capacity to sense what's nourishing and what's toxic, what's safe and what's dangerous, what's ours and what belongs to someone else. Active imagination, as developed by Carl Jung, becomes a bridge back to these exiled parts. When we dialogue with our symptoms, our dreams, our body sensations, as if they were wise messengers rather than problems to solve, we begin to hear the voices of our instinctual self that have been trying to communicate with us for decades. The revolutionary insight from internal family systems therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz, is that we don't have just one self. We have multiple parts, and many of these parts went into exile to protect our core self from annihilation. Healing happens not when we integrate our trauma, but when we retrieve our exiled parts and give them the safety they never had to exist in our conscious awareness. Do you recognize that sense of living like a stranger in your own life? That feeling that you're watching your existence from the outside, going through the motions of living but somehow not quite inhabiting your own experience? Maybe you've noticed that you can analyze your emotions but can't quite feel them, can think about what you need but can't quite sense what you want. Perhaps you've become an expert at taking care of everyone else's emotional needs, while your own remain mysterious, foreign, almost threatening. You might have noticed that you're more comfortable with other people's pain than with your own pleasure, more familiar with other people's desires than with your own instinctual knowing. Do you remember the last time you trusted a gut feeling without needing to rationalize it? The last time you said no simply because your body recoiled, or said yes simply because your soul leaped towards something? If these moments feel rare or absent, you're not broken. You're in exile from the part of yourself that knows how to navigate life through feeling rather than thinking. Tonight, I invite you to begin what I call the retrieval ritual, a practice of calling home your exiled instinctual self. Find a quiet space where you won't be interrupted. This is sacred work, so treat it as such. Begin by placing your hands on your body, your heart, your belly, your throat, wherever you feel drawn. Close your eyes and ask, what part of me did I send away for safety? Don't think the answer. Let it arise as image, sensation, or knowing. Now imagine that exiled part of yourself as a child or animal that has been hiding in the wilderness of your unconscious. What would you need to do to earn their trust? What would you need to promise them about their safety in order for them to consider coming home? Write a letter to this exiled part, not from your healed self to your broken self, but from your current adult self to the part of you that had to leave in order for you to survive. Thank them for their sacrifice. Apologize for how long they've been alone. Promise them that you're ready to create a different kind of safety now. Not the safety of hiding, but the safety of authentic expression. You didn't come to this world to be understood, but to remember yourself. And now we arrive at the final paradox. The moment you stop needing to be understood by others is the moment you finally understand yourself. There is a secret that the soul whispers to every human being at birth, but the noise of the world drowns it out so quickly that most people spend their entire lives trying to remember what they forgot. The secret is this: you are not here to fit into anyone else's story about who you should be. You are not here to make sense to people who have never made the journey into their own depths. You came here to remember what you knew before you learned to doubt yourself, to retrieve what was yours before you gave it away for approval, to become who you have always been beneath all the costumes you wore to make others comfortable. The deepest freedom is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It's the freedom to be who you are without needing anyone else to validate that choice. When you stop trying to be understood and start living from your own understanding, something miraculous happens. The people meant for you begin to recognize you, and the people who were never meant for your journey naturally fall away. This isn't abandonment, it's alignment, the untranslatable language. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "The only journey is the one within." But there was a woman who discovered that this inner journey had given her fluency in a language that had no translation in the outer world. She could speak of the soul's seasons, the heart's geography, the spirit's hunger, but when she tried to explain her choices to others, they heard only foreign words. She learned that some experiences can only be understood by those who have lived them, and some truths can only be recognized by those who have earned them through their own descent into themselves. She stopped trying to translate her inner world for others and started living it fully. Mysteriously, this attracted people who spoke her language fluently, souls who had also made the journey home to themselves. The Solitude Sanctuary. Dr. Matthew Lieberman's research reveals that the brain's default mode network, active during rest and introspection, is crucial for self-understanding and meaning-making. There was a man who built what he called a solitude sanctuary, not a physical place, but a psychological space where he could exist without explanation, without performance, without the exhausting labor of making himself comprehensible to others. In this sanctuary, he discovered that loneliness and aloneness were not the same thing. Loneliness was the ache of being disconnected from authentic others. Aloneness was the joy of being connected to his authentic self. He learned that until he could be genuinely happy in his own company, he would always be performing happiness in others' company. The rejection revelation. Joseph Campbell spoke of the hero's journey, but there was a woman who discovered that her journey required what she called the sacred no. Every time someone rejected her for being too intense, too sensitive, too unconventional, she felt a strange gratitude arise. Not masochism, but recognition. They were showing her exactly who wasn't meant for her path. She began to understand that universal acceptance would have been the cruelest fate, because it would have meant she had diluted herself into generic acceptability. The people who couldn't understand her were not her enemies. They were her filters, helping her identify her true tribe by the simple act of stepping aside when her authentic self walked past. What positive psychology calls authentic happiness, research shows, can only emerge when we stop deriving our sense of self from external sources and begin cultivating what Dr. Kristin Neff calls self-compassion, the ability to relate to ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a beloved friend. But the spiritual dimension transcends psychology. When we finally stop abandoning ourselves for others' approval, we discover what mystics have always known, that the divine within us was never broken, never insufficient, never in need of improvement. What needed healing was our relationship to our own divinity, our capacity to recognize our intrinsic worth without external validation. The research of Dr. Sherry Turkle on digital connection reveals that we're more connected than ever, yet more lonely than ever, because we've confused being known with being understood. Being known requires only visibility. Being understood requires that others share our internal landscape. When we release the impossible burden of needing to be understood by everyone, we create space for the profound intimacy that comes from being truly known by the few who recognize the language of our souls. Carl Rogers discovered that the paradox of self-acceptance is that the more we accept ourselves exactly as we are, the more naturally we grow into who we're meant to become. But this growth happens from the inside out, not from the outside in. Can you feel how exhausting it has been trying to make yourself comprehensible to people who speak different languages of the heart? How much energy you've spent translating your truth into formats others could digest, diluting your essence until it became palatable to palates that were never meant to taste your particular flavor of aliveness? Maybe you've noticed that the moments when you felt most rejected were often the moments when you were being most authentic. And perhaps you're beginning to sense that this rejection wasn't punishment. It was information. It was your soul's way of showing you who belongs in your inner circle and who belongs in your outer world. Do you remember what it felt like to be completely yourself with someone who didn't need you to be different? Someone who didn't try to fix, improve, or modify your natural way of being? If you can remember even one such moment, you know what it feels like when understanding is not required because recognition is present. I do not belong where I have to pretend to be someone else. This is not a statement of defiance. It's a declaration of spiritual hygiene. It's the recognition that belonging that requires self-betrayal is not belonging at all. It's imprisonment with the illusion of connection. You came to this earth carrying a specific frequency, a unique combination of gifts, wounds, wisdom, and wonder that has never existed before and will never exist again. Your job is not to modulate this frequency so others can easily receive it. Your job is to broadcast it clearly and let those who are tuned to your station find you naturally. The world does not need another version of someone who already exists. The world needs the first and only version of you, not the improved you, not the perfected you, not the you that everyone can understand, but the you that you were before you learned to apologize for your existence. For your final ritual, I invite you to write your own declaration of independence, not from others, but from the tyranny of their opinions about who you should be. Complete these sentences with whatever arises from the deepest part of your knowing. I give myself permission to be. I no longer need approval for. I choose to honor in myself. I release the need to explain. Read this declaration aloud, preferably in a place that feels sacred to you, in nature, by candlelight, or simply in the quiet of your own space. Let your nervous system hear your voice claiming your right to exist as you are. Then tomorrow, live one day as if this declaration were not just true but sacred law. Notice what changes in your body, your choices, your relationships when you move through the world from this place of self-recognition rather than self-improvement. If this journey into the depths of authentic selfhood has stirred something in your soul, I deeply invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. We're not just creating content here, we're creating a sanctuary for souls who are ready to stop performing their lives and start living them. Hit that notification bell because these conversations don't exist anywhere else, and your authentic self deserves to hear what we're exploring together. What did this video awaken in you? What part of your authentic self is asking to come out of hiding? Share your reflections in the comments below, not for validation, but for communion with others who speak the language of the soul. And when you're ready to continue this inner work, the next video in our journey is waiting for you. Your soul knows which one it needs to hear next. Remember, you didn't come here to fit in. You came here to find out who you are when you finally stop trying to be someone else.